So for the last month or so, we've been approaching the subject from different angles, and the subject being the mystical union, the kind of the rejoining of the individualized consciousness that we are with the universal consciousness that God is. And I thought we were done. I thought we had brought that to a closure. And yet when I sat down yesterday and began to listen to the ideas, to what it was that Spirit was moving to speak about, there was another aspect of this whole topic that came to me to explore, and I wanted to share that with you today. Now, when it first came to me, it was kind of interesting because it came to me almost, excuse me, in biblical terms. It came with the idea of, what have you let hinder you? What have you let hinder you? And I didn't, I was never a Bible scholar. When I was a child in school, we didn't really explore the Bible a whole lot. We were kind of told on Sundays what parts of the Bible we needed to pay attention to that week. So I was not very well read, and even in later years, as I read, I didn't take the task of memorizing, but that stuck with me. What did you let hinder you? And as I started to explore that, as I looked it up, for those who are interested, it's in St. Paul's letter to the Galatians. What it was about, what the whole idea of what did you let hinder you, where that came from, is that, and again, this is, I have no idea of knowing historically how accurate this is. This is what people have ascribed the meanings of this to be. But the general reading, if you read through the different analysis on the internet, what different preachers have had to say about it is that Paul had passed through this area of the Middle East, and he had called Galatia, and he had established several churches there, the Galatians, and he moved on, and he was through there, and word came to him that the people in these churches, that they were kind of sliding backwards to the old ways of doing things. And what had happened is that there were, you may remember in the early history of the Christian church, that there was this struggle about whether Christians were Jews or whether Christians were different than Jews. Christianity started as a branch of Judaism. And then, of course, historically what happened is when the Romans destroyed the temple in 66 AD, Judaism as it existed ceased to exist, because Judaism had been kind of a temple-centric religion. People had to go to the temple twice a year to fulfill their spiritual obligations and those things. So suddenly what happened was that Judaism didn't exist as it had been known. It didn't exist. It got scattered to the outlying areas. And early Christianity, as it was known, did not exist, because the early followers of Jesus, his brother James and the rest of the apostles, many of them were still in Jerusalem, so they got scattered to the wind as well. So you have to understand the context of everything. All the old ways were kind of cast aside, and in the midst of this, Paul emerges, and he is taking his own brand of Christianity to the rest of the world. He decided that Christianity was not just a message for the Jewish people at the time, that it was not just part of Judaism, that it was a message that was for everybody. So there was this struggle going on about whether the early Christians were really Jews or not, and whether they needed to adhere to the laws of Judaism. And what had happened was Paul had passed through Galatia. He had started these churches, and he got wherever he was going, up in Asia Minor, and word came to him that someone had come behind him. Someone came behind him and went to these churches and told them, no, you can be Christian, you can believe in the Christ, but you also need to adhere to the law. You need to do things the old way, particularly with regard to the circumcision of males. And Paul's response was the letter to the Galatians, the epistle to the Galatians. And basically what he was telling people is, don't let yourselves become slaves unto the law, unto the things that you have to do. Remember, a lot at the first level of consciousness, and what we'll see if you go back particularly into Old Testament theology, is there's a lot of focus on behavior, on activities. It's what you do that's important. God is watching everything that you do, and you need to do the things that you're supposed to do, and you need to not do the things that you're not supposed to do. And if you miss a step, there's guilt. There's this tremendous guilt that we hear of. Somebody somewhere did a count. I have no idea, again, if it's entirely true or not, but it's generally used that the number 611, that if you went through the Old Testament, that there were a total of 611 different things that you either had to do or had to avoid doing in the course of a day in order to live a pure life, in order to be good, so to speak. And of course, it's impossible for any one of us. How many of us, especially if you have a planner and you write down on your to-do list your top 10 things to do that day, how many of us even get the top 3 or 4 done before we get distracted? So there was a lot of focus in terms of thinking of law in that context, not in law as law of mind as we use it, but thinking of law in terms of rules of behavior. There were a lot of things that people were supposed to do and not supposed to do. And what had happened was Paul came through and he told these people, good news, we're all just wonderful, we're all okay, we're all saved in Christ, in the Christ consciousness. That's where the future is. And then somebody else came back behind him and said, no, you still need to adhere to all the old laws. And what Paul was telling them is, what hindered you? Why did you go back? Why did you go back to believing that there's something that you can do? This is a big shift in consciousness, by the way. This is a shift between level 1 and level 2. Level 1 consciousness thinks there's something I can do, right? The ego's talking. There's something that I can do, I should or shouldn't do, but there's a behavior, there's an activity, there's something I need to jump in and I need to start doing. Right? In the cavalry there was a saying, when in doubt, gallop. And in the infantry there was a saying that says, don't just stand there, do something. Right? The activity, the appearance of movement, get in there, make something happen. And you'll see this in our culture. There's a tremendous bias in our culture to action. Somebody starts moving, somebody starts acting like they know what they're going to do, people will follow that person. Whether they know what they're doing or not, they will follow that person. So what had happened is the people in this area, they started to go back to the old ways, and they said, oh, well, it's great to believe in the grace of God. It's great to believe that there's this presence within us that is working within us to do within us what needs to be done to lead us back into this experience of unity, which people in those days would call heaven, right? Going to heaven. But we need to be busy. We need to get in here and we need to start behaving. We need to start doing. We need to adhere to the old laws. And what Paul was telling them is this belief that you have, this idea that you have, I'm going to put it in another term, it's this delusion that you have that you of your own self can do anything to somehow make yourself worthy, is wrong, and it's holding you back because it's getting you stuck into meaningless activity. And you need to let go of that. And you need to accept the new way of thinking. You need to move into the new level of consciousness, which is it's not about your behavior. It's about your consciousness. And he called it faith. We call it believing so certain it is done that you can't entertain the opposite. He called it faith. It's your faith. Now this is the argument if you've grown up in a traditional Christian church. This is the argument you might hear about faith faith alone can justify, and faith without works is dead. This is the way that argument unfolded over the centuries. There's people who say, you're predestined, there's nothing at all that you can do, if God's going to save you, God's going to save you. And then there's other people who say, no, you have to participate, you have to get in here, and you have to do something. And here we have Paul, and keep in mind, Paul, a lot of what comes to us in terms of what Christianity is today comes to us through Paul because of what happened in Jerusalem in 66 AD. Most of the original followers of Jesus were scattered. Paul never met Jesus himself. Paul had a mystical experience. Paul was knocked off his horse and blinded by the light. Right? And his claim is that this is what was revealed to him in his mystical union, his mystical experience. So he never had the experience in the flesh of the presence of the divine. So what we're getting is we're getting Paul's influence, which really took Christianity into the modern world at the time, and it is Paul who is telling everybody, break with the old ways. You don't need to adhere to the old ways and to the old laws. You have to have the consciousness first. Don't worry about the actions, worry about the consciousness. Perhaps to put it into other terms that you hear in the New Testament, the New Testament has Jesus saying, it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles, it is every word that comes out of your mouth. And again, this had to do with that struggle that early Christianity was going through of whether or not they could allow people to come to the Christian church who did not adhere to the kosher laws, who were unclean people who did not adhere to the kosher laws. They ate food that was unclean. So we have the start of this shift early on in the unfoldment of Christianity, which is a movement actually between the Orthodox and the Gnostic way of thinking, or the level 1 and the level 2 way of thinking. And what that is telling us then is, don't try so hard. See, this is the evolution of how this idea came to me. So the first thing that came to me was, what hindered you? And what hinders us is our belief that we can do something. We can get in there. We can make it happen. We can struggle. We can fight. We can do whatever we have to do to move beyond whatever it is that has been holding us back, so that we can move into this experience that we've been talking about for the month, the mystical union, the experience of the presence of God. Then the second evolution of the thought, when it unfolded as I sat and just kind of listened, which is the way things happen. I kind of sit and listen, and I get ideas, and then I go pull books off the bookshelf that seem to have something related to that idea, and then I kind of read through those, and then I sit some more and I listen. And the second iteration was rending the veil. And I was trying to remember where I first or last perhaps got that rending the veil, and it was from a chapter in Emma Curtis Hopkins. Now, the idea of rending the veil came to us again from New Testament theology. And what we're told, and again, this is coming to us from New Testament theology, so we don't know unless we go back to source, unless we go back to the sources within Judaism. But the way that the story is told, the way that the ideas unfold, is that inside the temple, inside the Jewish temple, there was a section inside the temple that was called the Holy of Holies. And it was in this place in a temple that God lived. Excuse me. The presence of God was in this place called the Holy of Holies. And no one could enter there except the high priest, and then only on a certain day of the year, and then only if the high priest himself was without blemish. If there was any sores or anything on his body, he couldn't go because he wasn't worthy. He wasn't worthy to be in the presence of the divine. So this Holy of Holies had a veil, which was a thick curtain. And now, actually, somewhere on the internet, somebody says it was 4 inches thick. Now, how they know it was 4 inches thick, I have no idea. But they claim that it was 4 inches thick. There are some descriptions of it, of what the colors were and what was stenciled on it. Interestingly enough, the cherubim were there, and you may recall the cherubim also outside the Garden of Eden. Right? When Adam and Eve left the garden, the cherubim were there to keep human consciousness from getting back in. Human consciousness can't go back in. The cherubim are there, and the cherubim are here on this veil. And what we're told in New Testament theology is that at the moment that Jesus died on the cross, the veil was rended from top to bottom, this 4-inch curtain, mysteriously, magically, mystically, miraculously, however you want to think of it, it ripped open from bottom to top, and it threw open the Holy of Holies to public view. And of course, the meaning that theologians take from that is that the apparent separation between God and man was over. That's the way that they think about it. The veil represented this belief that somehow humanity is separated from its creator. Now you have to go back a little bit. If you enjoy reading, please pick up some of Joseph Campbell's works and start to dig through them. He does an excellent job of going through religions and mythologies of the world and showing us where things tie together and what common meaning they might be pointing to. But one thing that he points out is that the religions of the Europeans came to Europe from the Middle East, and the religions of the Middle East, as opposed to the Far East, the religions of the Middle East were based on a belief in separation. God was out there, humanity was over here, and never the twain shall meet. So a lot of the ideas then that we talk about that come to us from the religions of the Middle East are crossing this divide. How do we get across this divide? Do we have the angels and the saints and the saviors that need to go back and forth and cross the divide for us? Whereas in the Far East, the religions were that the presence is within us. The divine presence is already here. It is already within us. Now we do not see it, we do not experience it because of the delusions, the cloaks of ignorance that have been cast upon us. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So in the Far East, the presence is already within, and it's a matter of us awakening to that, discovering that, and moving through the ideas that limit us from that experience. And in the Middle East, it was more of an idea that the divine was out there somewhere, and we were always going to be different from it, different than it, separated from it, those kind of ideas. But with this rending of the veil in the ideas of the New Testament, with this rending of the veil, this idea of the separation, this idea of the separation of God from its creation is dispelled. That's the interpretation that people put into this. Now, remember, I'm approaching these as teaching stories, not literal fact. I'm approaching them and saying, well, what does this mean? Why is that there? Why is that in the story? Did it literally really happen? Perhaps so, perhaps not. But why is it there in the story? It's there to teach us something. It's there to represent a value. And the value that it tends to represent is that the separation at that moment, if we come to an understanding of what Christ consciousness is, which is the awareness of the presence of God within. So if we come to that, then that veil of separation is rended, it is ripped, it is torn in half. Interestingly enough, as I was kind of poking around reading different articles about this, in some traditions, the cherubim that were standing outside the Garden of Eden, protecting the Garden of Eden to keep human beings from wandering in, they disappeared at the moment that the veil rended. Right? So this idea that somehow we human beings are being kept separate from the divine, that idea starts to melt in the tradition of the Middle East, in a new way of thinking of the Middle East. Now this is important. If we go back then and think about what this veil is, this is what leads to the third iteration. Remember, it started with what can hinder you, and then rend the veil, tear down the things that could hinder you, because the things that hinder you are ideas, they are beliefs, they are opinions, they are worldviews. That's what they are. What holds us back is inside our own consciousness. And now the question becomes, well, well, what is it that gets rid of these blockages, these seeming impediments to our growth? And then that brings us to the third iteration, which is get out of the way. Get out of the way. Because what happens is in our culture, which is a culture that worships busyness, that celebrates the difficult, that pays athletes millions and millions of dollars a year to do something just because it's harder than anything that the rest of us can do, right? We glorify making something difficult as opposed to making it easy. You know, you've heard me say, what happens if we put the basket down to 4.5 feet? Who's going to go to the basketball game and watch it? Nobody. Nobody's going to go pay to see that. We want it to be difficult. We want to see them make that 3-point shot at the buzzer. So our culture kind of celebrates making things harder than they need to be. And when we start to come to the awakening that the presence is within us, our natural tendency to help things along, to make it better, is to make it harder than it needs to be, to make it harder than it needs to be. We get in our own way. Our busyness prevents us from experiencing the presence that is there, because we're making it hard. We believe in the necessity of struggle. We believe in the value of difficulty. You might remember a few months ago I was talking about Pema Chodron, the Buddhist monk, and she said it seems to be a natural tendency of the human beings to say one thing and then do exactly the opposite. And the example she gave, was that she was commissioned to write a book on peace, and she kept putting off going about doing the tasks she needed to do until it became hopelessly late. And then she worked herself up into a fervor, if you will, of trying to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to write, and then becoming very, very testy with everybody else as they began to get up during the day, or people came to the door to visit or make deliveries. And she realized that what she had done is she set out with the intention of writing a book about peace, and through her behavior she created a set of circumstances exactly unlike peace. And we tend to do that. We as human beings tend to do that. We take something that is very, very simple and we make it very, very difficult because we believe it needs to be difficult to be valuable. Right? That is one of the fundamental lies of our society. If it's not difficult, then it's just of no value. Just not valuable at all. So very briefly, we want to consider that this idea of the presence of an energy within us, a spiritual energy within us, this idea of the presence of this energy, which is some part of the divine itself, is an idea that transcends cultures. You can travel around the world and you can find many different cultures that have this idea of this presence of this energy within us that is trying to awaken. And when it awakens, it rises up. Literally, in the traditions, it rises up. It starts at the base of our spine. This energy in the Eastern tradition is coiled around the base of the spine as a serpent. 3.5 times it's coiled around the base of the spine. That's the way the Kundalini energy, the spiritual energy, is represented. And by the way, you will find that same symbol on the altars of early Catholic churches as late as the 4th century. That symbolism appears in sculptures in the Catholic Church. Same symbolism, same representation. If you go down to to the Aztecs, if you go down to Mexico and you look at the worship of the serpent, you start to see these things. We had a serpent in the Garden of Eden. We start to see in the Hopi Indians of the desert Southwest, we start to see this recognition of this energy that is within us, that they believe coiled at the base of the spine, that is trying to rise up. The same symbolism exists in the desert tribes of Africa. So there is this awareness of human consciousness. Campbell would say that what happens is these primal truths start to emerge through human consciousness, and we color them in the costumes and the characters of our own culture. So the same ideas emerge in different spots of the world, but each culture kind of tells the story a little bit differently. But they're all trying to say the same thing. There is this presence within, there is this divine energy within that is trying to emerge. And how it got there is also interesting. How it got there, the idea then is that this the divine, as it comes into expression in life, it moves from the finer to the more gross, meaning denser, heavier, things that you can weigh and you can touch. So you see the invisible energy that the divine is taking on form, taking on quantum particles, then taking on protons and electrons and the things that we recognize in Newtonian physics. Excuse me. And then taking specific shape, taking specific form, coming together and organizing itself. Coming together and forming plants and forming animals. So we have that kind of idea at the level of the macrocosm, the big. But at the level of the microcosm of the little, it's the same idea. And the idea is that the divine energy enters the human body through the top of the head. Right? And the Hopi Indians, in their tradition, that's why the soft spot is there when a child is born. Right? This is where the God presence has entered. This is why in some cultures it's not acceptable to touch children on the top of their head. There's some kind of an awareness, there's some kind of an idea that somehow this divine energy has come down and it has entered. And for those who understand the chakra systems, the chakra that's above the top of the head, that's where the unification is, right? That's where the divine presence is undifferentiated. But as it starts to make its descent to the denser and the grosser levels down through the human experience, a couple things happen. It becomes more and more dense, like steam becomes water and then becomes ice. But it also experiences the delusion that the Hindus call the Maya, the ignorance. The simplest way that I can explain is it starts to believe that the experience that it's having in these different forms is the real experience, the ultimate experience, the only experience. So what we're told in some of the Hindu traditions that probably explain it the clearest, if it's possible to explain it clearly, is that which is all-knowing, that which is omniscient, has the cloak of illusion, of ignorance. It has the veil of ignorance put upon it that leads it to believe that it doesn't know everything, that its knowledge is limited, that which is omnipotent has a cloak or a veil of ignorance put upon it by the very act of descending from the spiritual down into the form, into the physical, to where it believes there are certain things that it can do and it can't do. That which is omnipresence, that which is everywhere present, starts to have this cloak of ignorance put upon it that says, no, you're only here, you're only You're only in this spot. You're not connected to everything. The sense of individuality. That which is perfect has a cloak put upon it where it no longer recognizes its perfection, but it believes in imperfection. It believes it's missing, and desires arise for people or for things because we're suffering under the delusion that somehow if we get these people or these things into our lives, somehow we're gonna feel better. And that which is without time, that which is eternal, forgets its eternalness and believes in the passage of time in old age and in death. So we have these cloaks of ignorance put upon us. One thing that I came across as I was looking through this, because it reminded me of something I had read about the removal of the veils, the 7 veils. Kind of an interesting journey off to the side. But it was actually Oscar Wilde who labeled Salome's dance for Herod in the New Testament as the dance of the 7 veils, and people wondered where he got that from. And they thought that he got it from Ishtar's descent to the underworld back thousands of years before Christ in the Mesopotamian culture. And the story of Ishtar, who was Easter, and we talk about that when it comes to Easter, was actually a name for a goddess that had preceded her in another culture that existed from 4000 BC. 4000 BC. And the mythology is that the goddess was the queen of heaven, and she, for whatever reason, the reason's not explained, which I think is telling in itself. Why did God decide to incarnate, to come into the world as human beings? It's not explained. But this queen, for whatever her reasons, decides that she wants to go to the netherworld. And in order to do so, she meets a gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper goes to the queen of the underworld, who's the queen of heaven's sister, by the way, and gets permission to let her in. But there's 7 gates that she has to pass through, 7 gates. And at each gate, she has to remove something. So the first gate, she removes the crown. She gives them the crown. And the second gate, she removes the earrings. And the third gate, she removes her necklace. And the fourth gate, she removes her breastplate. And the fifth gate, she removes her girdle, and then her loincloth, and then her bracelets. And you can see that these gates that she's passing through are kind of aligned with what the Eastern traditions teach us as the chakra. Remind you now, this is 4000 BC. So as the Queen of Heaven, as the Spirit of the Divine passes down into the netherworld, right, it forgets the crown, it forgets the earrings, it forgets the necklace, it forgets all of the things that are attributed to these realms of energy. And it is only when Ishtar arrives into the last realm, the earth realm, the netherworld, then she is subjected to disease and to pain and to suffering. And I thought, wow. So here we have this mythology from Mesopotamia from 4,000 years ago, and then we have Hindu teachings, I don't know how old, talking similar things. We have tradition in the Hopi Indians teaching us the same thing. And then the question becomes, what is it that we do to awaken? Now, once we have awakened to it, what is it that we can possibly do in order to get that energy to go back up? Again, in the tradition of Kundalini Yoga, it's how do you get that serpent to start to uncoil, to rise up? Just a side note, think about the symbol for medicine in our culture, and it is a staff, which could be the spine, represented by the 2 serpents uncoiling up it, which looks like the double helix of DNA. Very, very ancient ideas with very, very modern ties. So this is where we don't get in your own way. Don't get in your own way. So what happens to us is that we as human beings, we start to become aware of this presence within us. Now, you have to keep in mind, we did not put that presence within ourselves. It's already there. And it is already there, as the poet says, lying in quiet repose, waiting for that moment that we shall awaken, waiting for that moment that we will go, oh my goodness, I am more than just flesh and blood. I am more than just skin and bones. There's a little something within me that I did not make. Even go back to the book of Genesis and go back to the earliest tradition. God created Adam out of the clay, or he took up 100 pounds of clay. We all learned that in rock and roll. He took up 100 pounds of clay. But then God breathed into that clay. It was the very breath of the Spirit that animates the clay. And what happens upon death is the earth goes back to the earth, dust to dust. But the Spirit goes back to God. The Spirit goes back to God. Very ancient ideas that which animates the material, the gross material, the dense material that is our bodies, is animated by the very Spirit, the very breath of God within us. And as we come to be aware of that, we start to wonder, well, what can I possibly do to expedite this awakening? What can I possibly do to move it along more quickly? How can I force that energy up to conscious reunion with the divine? So we will find, we will find in different teachings, we will find all kinds of things to do, all kinds of things to do, all kinds of laws or rules of behavior to engage in that are supposed to help it move up quickly. Excuse me. There are rules about breathing so many times in one nostril and so many times in another nostril, and how to make your tummy go in and out as you breathe, and breathe the breath of fire, and all of these things that we're supposed to do, foods that we're supposed to eat, foods that we're not supposed to eat, fasting, going and living in the woods, all these kinds of different things that people have come up with. And I'm not saying anything bad about any of those. If you believe that they're going to work, they're going to work because it's done unto you according to your belief. But they make it difficult, you see. They make it difficult. And part of the ego consciousness says it has to be difficult to be worthwhile. So I have to get in here and I have to fight and I have to struggle and I have to do what I need to do in order to push my consciousness past this crazy idea that somehow I'm separated from God. And the more we try, the harder it gets, because now we're not moving towards the goal. We are focusing all of our energy on what we're doing. We're focusing all of our energy on the problem, on the belief that something could impede the inevitableness of God and leave us stuck. Emma Curtis Hopkins, when I went back and reread her chapter on rending the veil, she said what that means is don't be deceived. Don't be deceived. Rend the veil. Don't be deceived. Don't believe in the deception that there is anything that could hold you back, and that there's anything that you could personally do to fight against it, to break through it. Because the more you try to fight against it, the more you stay stuck to it. She gives the example in her chapter of a practitioner who is treating a client for a cough. And the practitioner was putting all of her energy into the cough, thinking about the cough and thinking about no cough and thinking about spirit fighting the cough and all of these kind of things that we sometimes do in our delusion. And nothing worked. And one day the spirit said, the practitioner said, why am I spending all my energy on that which is not real anyway? The cough is nothing but a lie pretending to be the truth. Spirit knows how to demonstrate itself as good health. I give up fighting the cough. And with that, the cough went away. The client's cough went away. See, when we put all of our energy into the struggle, we are creating a reality that does not exist outside of our mind. So all of these different techniques, all of these different things that we try to do or not do physically are kind of the equivalent of Paul saying to the Galatians, what did you let hinder you? What did you let hinder you? Why are you believing that there's anything there that's real to struggle against? So at the physical level, the level of the ego, we want something to fight against and to struggle with, and we want to feel strong, so we try to get in there and figure out what it is that we're going to do to make that energy move back up, make our consciousness move past and through the veils, through the cloaks of ignorance, and move past the delusions until we finally get to the realization of the divine consciousness, the mystical union with God. And then, if that doesn't get us, then the intellect will. And the intellect tells us, well, no, there's not a whole lot that you need to do to struggle with, but there's something you need to know to struggle with. That you're stuck because of old ideas, and what you need to do is you need to find those old ideas, and you need to get in and dig out those old ideas, and you need to struggle with those old ideas, and you need to defeat those old ideas and make them go away. Because unless you change them, they will continue to act out in your life over and over and over again. Jung said that, and Ernest Holmes quotes him with that. The difference that we want to think of is what changes them, what changes them. So the intellect is telling us is that you're smart enough to figure this out. You're smart enough to get in there and find these ideas that have been holding you back. You're smart enough to neutralize those ideas with the truth. And you're intelligent enough to figure out how to make your consciousness rise, how to make this spiritual energy move through the veils of delusion until you experience the mystical union with the divine. And that's just making it harder intellectually. And that is also keeping us stuck in the problem, stuck in the condition. And it is not really helping us to move forward. And then we have to come to this idea of the activity of God within, which we will call grace. Grace is the activity of God within that is not for no other reason than it is, I guess is the best way to put it. If you needed a sprinkler system put in your lawn and you hire somebody to come and they dig up your yard and they put it in, you pay them. And so paying them is not grace. It's a transaction. Them digging up your yard is not grace. It is a transaction. In a lot of our relationships with God, we try to make transactional. Oh God, if you do this for me, I'll be good. And this time, I really mean it. But divine grace is generally considered, if you're thinking about grace, it is the activity of God within us, and it's not a repayment for anything. It just is. That's just the way it is. We breathe by grace. It just is. Our heart beats by grace. Our body knows how to digest food by grace. It is the activity of God within us, doing whatever needs to be done. So what we want to come to is a realization then that we did not put the spark of the divine within us, that we awaken to its presence because of divine grace, because it is the divine calling us to itself. It is, as Meister Eckhart says, it is like the person playing hide and seek who clears his voice so you'll find him. The divine has created us to awaken to its presence. And our awakening to its presence was inevitable. Inevitable. We might be able to impede it or delay it or make it seem that we impeded it or delayed it as we wander about exploring different things in life. But at some point it becomes inevitable that we awaken to it. And what we want to recognize is that it knows how to do what needs to be done to continue this process of awakening within us. It doesn't need us to jump in and try to force it to happen. It doesn't need us to jump in and try to make it happen. It doesn't need us to jump in and try too hard. It doesn't need us to try to intellectualize it or to think about it or to dig up old ideas and cast them away. What it needs us to do is to cooperate with it. To cooperate with it. To trust in it. To accept its activity moving up through us, within us. So the reason that this argument, this discussion arose in the first place in early Christianity was this idea of, well, if I don't have to follow the law anymore, you see, if all I have to do is say that I believe and everything's okay, then won't we just all become terrible criminals and go around robbing and stealing from one another and doing all sorts of terrible things because the law is no longer valid? And that's a complete human explanation, but a complete misunderstanding of what we're talking about. I want you to think about the fire. I want you to think about the different times and the different traditions that talk about the flame within. You know, if you go past the Methodist Church to this day, there's a symbol of a cross. It's a Christian denomination, but it's enveloped in a flame. It's enveloped in a flame, the fire of the Holy Spirit. Right? The presence of God within, the Holy Spirit, the doer of the word within. We talk about the fire breathing in the Hindu traditions, and many traditions talk about this fire, that this awareness of this presence within us is like becoming aware of the fire that burns but does not consume. And that what is happening is that fire is becoming fanned into a furnace, into a great heat, into a great desire, an intention to experience the presence of God. And as it does so, and as it starts to rise up back to the source, it consumes, it dissolves, it melts away everything unlike itself. In other words, our desire to steal would go away. Our desire to harm another would go away. And the reason is that those desires were false desires. They were desires that came from a belief in separation from our perfection. And as our realization of perfection starts to increase, those desires go away. So whatever we need to let go of along the way of our spiritual growth, that energy within us, that presence within us, knows how to melt them away, knows how to dissolve them. In fact, it doesn't even know they're there. They just dissolve away as darkness dissolves in the presence of light. When a beam of light can travel all the way through space and never be aware of the darkness that surrounds it, the beam of light that is trying to emerge from within us knows nothing of these delusions that we have allowed ourselves to suffer under. But it does dispel them as the light dispels the darkness. So what I would hope that we take away from today is this. Realize that which we would call success, the ultimate experience of the union of our individualized consciousness with the divine consciousness, it is assured. And we don't have to try to work so hard to make something happen as much as we have to surrender to it, accept it, and let it happen. Let it happen. Turn our presence, our attention to the presence of the divine within. Invite it to do what it knows how to do, what it created to be done as us, which is to return back home. It came into the world as us to have a unique experience as us and to return to itself in a unique way. We invite it to lead us, to guide us, to direct us to let go of whatever it is that ought to be let go of. To do our own dance of the seven veils, to remove the cloaks of ignorance one at a time. so that we may see God as God is, that we may see things as things are. Dr. Holmes tells us in the textbook that we have made a riddle out of simplicity. That the farmer sees the divine in the fields, that the mother feels the presence of God when she clasps her baby to her breast. And that we look too hard and too far away for the presence of God. The presence is within. We won't find it anywhere else. We can't beat it out of us. We can't think it out of us. But we can surrender to its activity and trust its grace, its knowing of what to do, when to do it, and how to do it as us. So I invite you this week, let your prayer, let your treatment every day be to know that this presence is within, doing whatever needs must be for the full and complete awakening of that part of itself known as you into the reabsorption of the self with a capital S. And so it is.